name's Nicola Gale, and I'm a social scientist who's interested in risk work. And by that I mean the everyday working practices of people whose job it is to assess and minimise health risks. And I'm talking today to Tom Marshall, whose research is on the early detection and prevention of disease. Tom, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your work, and what your interest is in risk?
Okay, well, my background is that I'm a public health physician. I previously trained in general practice before that, and I also have an interest in health economics. And in addition to early detection of disease and prevention of disease, I have an interest in how we communicate ideas of risk or probability of getting disease to patients in order to help them to make better decisions.
And can you tell me a little bit more about how you find out about risks?
How we find out about risk is quite interesting. We do that by doing studies called Cohort Studies. Now what that means is we do measurements on a large number of people, a large group of people, and those measurements might be simple things like asking people what their age is, determining what gender they are, asking them about smoking, maybe measuring their blood pressure, their weight, things like that. And then we follow or wait for a long period of time, follow them up for a long period of time to see if they get the illness that we're interested in. And from that we can work out the relationship between the things that we measured at the beginning and their chances of getting disease. So for example, if twice as many men get heart disease over a 5-year period, we can then say that men are twice as likely to get heart disease as women. So that's how we do that.
And in practice, like, how do you collect that information? You know, what do you ask people?
Well, in the context of the original study, you ask people or you measure things, and when you're trying to determine if somebody's sitting in front of you, trying to find out or work out for them what their chances are of getting the disease, you do more or less the same thing. So you ask them things about their own characteristics, like male or female, what age they are, whether they smoke or not, what their blood pressure is. So you might measure their blood pressure or measure their cholesterol levels by taking a blood sample. And so you in essence, repeat what was done in the original study, and then that's sort of plugged into either a computer program or an online calculator, or perhaps look up some tables to determine what their chances are of getting ill in the future.
So, once you've calculated that risk, what do you then actually say to people? What's the language that you use to describe that risk to people?
There are two elements to that. The first is you need to say in some way what their chances are, and the second thing is you need to say something about over what period of time. You could say, in the long run, over 100 years, the chances are that we'll all be dead, but that's not terribly helpful. So what we're interested in is risk over a period of time. So you could talk about somebody's chances of getting ill in the next year, if you were talking about the cold or something like that, and you could talk about somebody's chances of getting heart disease or something, or diabetes, over the next 10 years, over the next 5 years. So that's the first thing, is you have to talk about the length of time. And the second thing to do is to say, make it meaningful to them. And the most useful way of expressing risk probably is to say, out of 100 people like you, how many are likely to get ill over that period of time? So we could say, out of 100 people like you, we'd expect maybe 20 to get the common cold at some point over the next year. Or we might say, over the next 10 years, out of 100 people like you, 5 will get heart disease, or 10 will get heart disease.
And so you're always making guesses about the future on the basis of what's happened in the past. But in the kind of reality of the clinical consultation, the person sitting in front of you doesn't know whether they're the 5 in 100 who's going to get the heart disease or the 95 who aren't. And so what happens if you don't have that much information?
Well, even with limited information, you can say some things that might help with predicting the future. So for example, if you only know somebody's age and what gender they are, you can say, well, we'll have to guess that you're probably about average for a person of your age and gender. So the chances of you getting ill are about average for a person of your age and gender.
So it really strikes me that you've got this gap where there's this idea of people like you, but you actually really never know what's going to happen in your own future. You know, it's up to chance, so to speak. And I think from a social science point of view, I would be interested in how, what are all the other things in people's social lives that fit into making that decision? Because you get the information, you have the information, okay, you have this risk of getting this certain condition, but that doesn't necessarily result in some kind of action, some kind of changed behaviour, whether that's reducing smoking, increasing physical activity, or starting to take some kind of preventative medication. And people are reliant on all sorts of things in their lives. So they might talk to their friends, they might talk to their family, they might see neighbours. They might also see things that don't necessarily fit with the risk information they've been given. So they might say, okay, yeah, but my 95-year-old auntie had smoked every day of her life and used to drink 5 whiskies before she went to bed, but she's okay. So you've always got the anomalies, the things that are out of the ordinary that almost kind of prove the rule. And is that really challenging in practice?
It is. There are several things that you've mentioned there that are quite complex to unpick. One of them is that we do tend to give greater weight to things that are close to us in terms of our own experience, but they could just be a fluke. There are flukes where young, apparently healthy people get ill unexpectedly, and there are people whose behaviours suggest that they're likely to get ill and who don't get ill. That's chance, and as I said, it's not 100% prediction. It's not always perfect. All you're saying is that on the balance of evidence, these are your predicted chances of getting ill, or your predicted chances of not getting ill. So that's the first thing to say about it. The second thing is that how people act is not necessarily just informed by what they think about their chances of getting ill, because after all, you can take the view that I've got a 1 in 100 chance of getting ill in the next 5 years, and I don't like that idea, so I'd like to do something to reduce that chance, and you'd be paying quite a lot of attention to what might seem on the face of it quite a small risk. But on the other hand, you might take the view that there's a 20 in 100 chance of me getting ill in the next 5 years, but I'm not too bothered about that, so I don't really see why I should do anything. So people can attach different weights to these chances. So there are two separate things here. One is about whether that prediction is approximately right and whether I believe it. And then the second thing is whether I think that's something worth acting on.
Yeah, and that issue of believing it also comes down to who's giving the information. That they might, trust their own GP, but they might have a concern perhaps about whether the wider kind of pharmaceutical industry or the medical profession, whether they're trustworthy. And that might then affect whether they take on board that information.
Yeah, the source of information is clearly important, and people weigh up the credibility of the source, and then they attach greater or lesser importance to information because of that source. And I think probably people believe sources that are a little bit closer to them, they feel they identify with, and maybe sources that they think of as more trusted. But that's interestingly true not just of the general public, but it's also true of doctors. So sometimes they also distrust sources of evidence or trust them because of where that source is.
My second conversation is with Mani Sidhu, who is a lecturer in social science as it's applied to health, and has done a lot of research on community health workers. Hi Mani.
Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your research?
Sure. I spent a lot of time doing research with community health workers about their role and what makes them tick. I spent a lot of time observing community health workers in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis, but also listening to first-hand accounts of their experiences. What's been insight is listening to their views and their opinions about the role that they do, but also some of the challenges that they face. As an outsider, it's been a real privilege to listen to their opinions.
So in the previous conversation, Tom and I were talking about risk and how difficult it is to pin down exactly what risk is and make it meaningful to people's everyday lives. In your research with community health workers, how do they deal with risk and manage different sorts of risks in their work?
As you might be aware, community health workers deal with risk in a number of ways, often calculating risk, explaining risk, and also trying to reduce the risk of patients in terms of being diagnosed with a particular illness. Often, From my research, I've understood that risk can be categorised within two camps, medical risk and social risk. And often medical risk takes precedent. This might include patients monitoring their blood pressure or regularly self-weighing so they don't become overweight. However, when people make lifestyle choices, medical risk normally isn't considered. Let's take, for example, if you're going to someone's house as a guest and they offer you sugary food or drink. It can be very difficult to say no, and it can be quite inhospitable to actually reject someone's offerings. Another example might be why people continue to use ingredients which are considered unhealthy, but often it's to do with maintaining customs, traditions and values as part of their communities. So continue to use ghee or lard instead of using healthier oils.
So how realistic then is it for community health workers to be able to persuade people to change their minds?
Well, community health workers face a number of challenges when they're helping people to reduce their risk, and a number of these challenges can be social factors. So there might be patients living in poor housing, they might be living on a low income where it makes it difficult for them to go shopping on a budget, or they might be working on a hazardous job. Often, it can be very difficult to make changes as part of these factors. So community health workers provide social support, they might provide appropriate advice to making better lifestyle choices, as well as helping people deal with medical risk, so asking them to continue taking their medication as part of aspects of adherence.
So the idea that someone is entirely responsible for their own health seems rather unfair when you've got all these kind of other social factors that affect people's health and aren't necessarily within their own grip or their own choice to change.
I think you can say that it's unfair because it's very difficult to place all the responsibility on someone's health, on the individual and the choices that they make. Let's take, for example, where someone lives or the job that they do. If someone's living in a very polluted part of the city, how easy is it for them to actually change where they live? Or if someone's undertaking a very hazardous job where they're exposed to different chemicals, how easy is it for them to change their job? Community health workers often deal with issues that go beyond their job description, such as dealing with welfare, dealing with unemployment, or helping people on a low income. Often, this type of work can be emotionally draining, and community health workers could benefit from additional support.
This last conversation is with Juliet Raymond, who's a researcher, a facilitator and a storyteller. And I'm going to be talking to her about the relationships between healthcare practitioners and their patients. Juliet, can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, of course. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm interested in people's experiences of both using health services and working in them. And most of my own work has been in maternity care, but obviously a lot of the issues that are important to maternity professionals, like working with risk, developing relationships, trying to do a really good job in a system that doesn't always support that, is important to lots of other healthcare professions too.
And when we talk about relationships, we tend to, I think about a kind of traditional model in healthcare where the doctor is the expert.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we often call that the doctor knows best model. The doctor is the expert and the patient comes to them for information about what they can do to help them get better.
And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because doctors, other healthcare professionals, health workers have trained sometimes for years to develop their knowledge and to get their qualifications.
Yeah, absolutely. Doctors have a lot of expertise and knowledge that patients can use to help them get better. But the risk is that sometimes that relationship can become a little bit unequal. In our society, we place a lot of weight on the information from experts and people who've had a lot of training, and that may not leave a whole lot of room for other kinds of information. So the information that a patient has about their own life experience or their tacit embodied knowledge, the stuff that's going on inside their body, how they can feel it.
And what happens when there isn't that space in the consultation for that kind of patient knowledge?
Well, I guess the risk is that if a patient feels like a doctor hasn't understood their concerns, then they might take their advice, go away and do absolutely nothing about it.
So can we look at it the other way? Can we say, okay, it should be about patient knows best rather than doctor knows best? You know, the patient has all that understanding about their own context, about the things in their life, and can just use the doctor's expertise as and when they need it.
Yeah, and that's what people do all the time. So they choose to go and consult a GP or a complementary therapist or a pharmacist, for example, and then they take the advice that they get from them, and then they go away and they decide what they're going to do about it.
So there are any situations where that doesn't work?
Yeah, of course, because in an emergency situation, a patient might not have a lot of control or choice over what happens to them. And also in the case of preventing disease, somebody may not feel unwell, so they don't have that embodied or tacit knowledge to bring to the encounter with the doctor.
So if the patient has got all the information about their own life and their context and the things that matter to them, and the doctor's got expert knowledge perhaps about a particular disease or what the risks are associated with a particular disease, then shouldn't they just work together?
Yes, and so we can have a we decide together approach, a partnership. And that means that the responsibility for making somebody better or preventing a future illness lies with both people, not just with one or the other. And that can be a really positive way of thinking about it. But of course that doesn't always work in certain situations. Again, we're talking about emergency situations, that might not be appropriate. And sometimes people may not trust the knowledge that they get from the doctors. So that can be challenging too. Or they might not feel like a doctor has an understanding of what their everyday life is like, the context, the sort of wider social context that they're living in. They may feel the doctor is too far removed from that to really understand what it's like.
So are there any ways around that? Any ways in which you can think about trying to bring these two very different forms of knowledge that may not always agree with each other together?
That's exactly where community health workers come in. So they act as a bridge between the sort of expert knowledge of doctors and the kinds of calculations that they do about the chances or risks of people developing certain conditions and the patients themselves. And they often have first-hand experience of living in a particular area, and also in many examples, they have an understanding of certain conditions or risks themselves that they've also shared, the same as the patient, and about lifestyle changes that they have made that are similar to the ones that they're encouraging their clients to make. And so that sort of shared experience can be a really positive influence in building warm relationships between practitioners and their clients.
But that can't always be easy.
No, not at all. And of course, there's an issue there, isn't there, about the different sorts of relationships that people might be managing at the same time. So if you live in a certain area, you may know a lot of local people, but then you may also be working with them or people that they know or members of their family as a professional. And so in managing that conflict or that tension between developing positive relationships as a client professional, and balancing that with personal relationships that might be happening outside of that room.
And you might feel like perhaps you're betraying one or the other of those kind of relationships or identities because of having, to report back up to your, the doctor who manages your practice, or perhaps account for the work that you do with your local community.
Yeah, absolutely. And the community health worker may also be working with some of the pressures or the expectations that come from the doctors that they work with, as well as the pressures and expectations that come from the clients that they're working with too.
So I expect a lot of the things that we've talked about today will feel really familiar to you. Calculating and assessing risk, modifying or developing interventions, and just relating to people are part of the everyday work of a health professional, any health professional, including community health workers. How do you build positive relationships with people when you're working with them to tell them that parts of their lives need to be changed? How do you design interventions that are realistic for different sorts of people? And what happens when you're trying to get someone to change something that you think might actually be unachievable? So all of these questions and many more are part of what makes this kind of work so challenging. And in this course, you're going to have the opportunity to reflect with your colleagues, with other people who are doing this kind of work on a day-to-day basis, about questions of risk, how you talk about risk, how you manage risk, how you deal with having to modify an intervention for an individual person, and how perhaps you maintain some kind of authentic relationship with clients or patients, while also managing the other things that you have to work towards, like key performance indicators.